Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Hope you're doing well, inshallah. So, this is the next discussion on our journey with Aristotle, looking at rhetoric. In this chapter, or in this video, what I want to do is look at chapter number 3 of the book, which is discussing 5 reasons why rhetoric is a useful or even an important art for us to learn. So remember that Aristotle says that rhetoric is the partner of dialectic, this toing and froing, and sort of coming down to the nub of our discussions. And he offers a number of arguments, like I said, 5 arguments in support of why it's important that we should and try learning and mastering the art of rhetoric. Number one, the first one is that without rhetoric, someone might fail to persuade others of truth and justice, which is like the ultimate good, right? We want to know the truth. We all want justice. And so if a person doesn't learn rhetoric, they may fail in achieving that higher objective. And so even though truth and justice are naturally strong or stronger than falsity and injustice, right? If all circumstances are equal and it turns out that truth and justice are less persuasive, you're not persuaded by the truthfulness of something, the justice of something, the justice of an argument, for example, because it's not being you're not persuaded by it, right? Then either the person who's communicating that to you has not done their job properly, or the listener, the audience, hasn't been listening or are not convinced, right? There's something's gone wrong there because either communicator, the rhetor, the person communicating that argument, hasn't done their job, or the people who are listening haven't understood. Even though the truth in of itself, the justice in of itself, is something that's inherently good, so that can happen as well. And so, so Aristotle believes that the human capacity for truth and justice is something that's inherent in all of us, and people who are philosophically virtuous, right? These people who are knowledgeable and good should engage in this science, and they should not somehow look down upon studying rhetoric, right? Seeing that something beneath them or neglect them, because this is shameful to Aristotle. Like, this is, how could you do this, right? You're a virtuous person. You want truth. You want justice. How could you neglect this art, which allows you to persuade people of the goodness of something? Okay, so this is something to bear in mind as well. The second reason he gives is that, and for the usefulness of rhetoric, is that not everybody can be taught, right? And some people just have to be persuaded, right? And there are people who are unwilling to learn the principles or the details of a subject, right? And so you need to be able to persuade them in a simplified form, right? You need to be able to simplify for them. So there might be someone who's knowledgeable in one area, but not knowledgeable in other areas, and so you're relying on the persuasion of the person who is knowledgeable in that area to persuade you, which happens in our day-to-day interactions. So, for example, we rely on what our doctors tell us, right? Because we don't have the medical knowledge, especially if you're not a doctor. So this is something to bear in mind as well. This is the second reason, which is that it's useful to persuade people who don't have expertise in that field. That's the second reason why rhetoric is very, very important. The first one, of course, is that people who are of virtue, people who are good, who don't engage in this science, right? This allows people who this allows false ideas, false impressions to get hold in society. The third reason is that learning to argue for and against anything is very, very useful. To be able to argue for something, but at the same time being able to think about what the counter arguments might be as well. Not just for like learning the merits of it, but also being persuasive about it, right? If you know what somebody's going to say when you make an argument or you make a statement in response, then you're going to get better. You're going to become better at trying to persuade people. Okay, um, so in that way, nothing's missed because you're thinking about what you're going to say. You're thinking about what they're going to say in response, and so your arguments, your ideas, and the way you're going to persuade people becomes much more persuasive as well. Um, and so you're not doing this to argue one side of the case, particular, but also it's a way of thinking through things, the dialectic, right? That if I write this, if I say this, then I also need to be aware that my audience will immediately think about this. So I need to also think about how I can convince them of the next argument and so forth, so on as well. So what it does is inoculates them from opposition, right? What other people might say, because you're already thinking about that. You're already one step ahead as well. Um, and so, um, but that if people don't do this, then bad ideas gain traction in society. So this is the third reason as well. Um, the fourth reason probably applies more to pre-modern societies and Greek societies, for example, more than it does to ours. And Aristotle thinks that, for example, is rhetoric is useful in the same way that, for example, martial arts might be useful to us today as well, right? That you need to be able to defend yourself physically, right? And so you should also be able to defend yourself verbally, right? And that's important as well. So some would even argue this is more important because language is more important than physical strength. People go to war based on the way others are able to persuade them, right? So this is something to bear in mind as well. That this is the fourth reason that it's a useful tool to defend yourself as well. The fifth one is really the most important one for our lesson today, and it's actually a critique that some people say that rhetoric is just sophistry. It's just like people just using rhetoric to convince people of falsehood, right? And then I'm going to quote this from the man himself, Aristotle. He says, "If it be objected that the one who uses such power of speech unjustly might do great harm, that is a charge which may be made in common against all good things except virtue, and above all against the things that are most useful as strength, health, wealth, and generalship. A man can confer the greatest of benefits by a right use of these, and inflict the greatest of injuries by using them wrongly." In other words, anything can be good or bad depending on your moral purpose. What are you using it for? Um, just to give an example, as a Muslim, someone might say, well, we shouldn't translate the Quran, or we shouldn't translate certain texts, like some of the kitabs, some of the books that are behind me. We shouldn't translate them because certain people may use it to attack Islam. Um, but it all comes down to the moral purpose of why someone what's their purpose. If they have a moral purpose, they'll use it for a good end as well. Because when rhetoric or anything is used justly, it makes it a great good. Okay, so it's not sophistry. Um, it's not like it's basically the moral purpose behind something. What makes something sophistry, a way to convince people towards a bad end, is um, it's the purpose behind it, right? So it's not rhetoric in of itself. That's a bad art in of itself as well. So that's something to bear in mind. Um, so this is something to bear in mind as well. What I'm going to do next video is talk about what rhetoric actually is. Until then, stay safe. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.